Right. I think that most of you have taken your seats. We're going to start a little late. I would like to welcome you most cordially to the second part of today's conference. Welcome to the panel discussion. As you know, we publish the new work on right-wing extremism in Europe today, country analyses, counter-strategies, and labor-related exit strategies. In the course of this discussion, we would like to go a bit more into detail. I'm particularly delighted to see that the four panelists are co-authors of our publication. Other co-authors are in the audience, which also holds true for the representatives of partner organizations that have contributed to the project of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. We're now going to talk about the radical right in Europe, trends and fields of action. Now, first of all, I'd like to introduce the panelists to you. To my left, there's Professor Vasiliki Georgiadou. She's a professor for political sciences and history at the Pantheon University of Athens. She wrote her doctoral thesis in Münster, and amongst other things, she is focusing on right-wing extremist parties in Europe and political and social radicalism in Greece. Right beside her, there is Dr. Eva Högel. She is a lawyer by profession, and since 1999 and 2009, she's been working in the Ministry for Social Affairs and Labour as the European Commissioner of the Ministry. And she was also head of the Department on European Employment and Social Policies. I think this fits in really nicely because labor market-related exit strategies is one of the main areas not only of the Xenos program but also of our publication. Since 2009, Eva Högel has been a member of the German Parliament, and she's the ombudswoman of the SPD parliamentary group in the NSU Investigation Committee. Beside her, Dr. Harald Weinböckel. He's a media and political scientist. He focuses on intervention and prevention, but he's a practitioner. He's very close to our target group, for that matter. He is the chairman of different organizations and networks dealing with violence and right-wing extremist prevention and de-radicalization strategies. And last but not least, there's Dr. Michael Minkenberg. He's a political scientist. Between 2007 and 2010, he has been the Max Weber Chair for German and European Studies in New York. Since 1998, he's been professor for comparative political studies at the Europe University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. His main area of responsibility are the radical right in liberal democracies and the relationship between religion and politics in Western democracies. My name is Ralf Melzer. I'm responsible for the project against right-wing extremism of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I'm going to chair this meeting. Welcome. I'm looking forward to our discussions. Let me tell you how we would like to proceed. Now, first of all, we'll have two discussion rounds up here on the panel, and then I'll throw the floor open for you in the audience. Now, if there are any questions, please feel free. You can make statements or ask questions, whatever you feel like. In the course of the discussion, we can also take up questions that are placed by internet users. We stream out this conference in the internet. And here I'm connected to my colleague Sebastian Serafin, who's going to forward questions from the internet to me. Mr. Minkenberg, when you look at the far right-wing extremist groups in Europe, what are the most important ones at the current moment in time, and what are the most important patterns that can be identified? Well, if you look at Europe as a whole, which means not only the European Union, but also beyond it, it can be observed that in almost all the countries, right-wing extremist parties have been founded which spread right-wing extremist populist ideologies as much as they can, but not all of them are represented in national parliaments. But with very few exceptions, such as the Federal Republic of Germany, who've got stable approval rates of 5% or even more in most of the countries. of Europe. Many studies showed that across the whole of Europe, there is a lot of xenophobia amongst the general population by and large. So not only do the political parties of right-wing extremists form a problem, but also in the population by and large you can find a significant level of extremism. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation published a lot of newspaper articles and reports indicating that amongst the general population, 10 to 20% of the people are xenophobic. These are the most important trends. There are people in the general population who are quite reluctant. There are people who are willing to use violence, although comparative studies are missing in this regard. So we can only make individual statements, but not draw a general European-wide comparison. But if you look at it from a more differentiated viewpoint, the well-established parties in the old democracies of Europe and the newly created democracies, there is a great deal of fluctuation amongst the voters, amongst the electorate. If you look at France, Belgium, or the Netherlands, here the results of elections remain rather stable, with the exception of 2002 in France, when Sarkozy tried to weaken the position of the Front National. But normally in the Netherlands, election results are quite reliable. New parties emerge, old parties disappear. They might range from 3 to 15%, as is the case in Eastern Europe. There's no stable party landscape in the region. This is one point. And the second point is that the parties that do exist in the region pursue an ideology or a strategy which is much more backwards oriented than the one in the West. It focuses on a past where democracy simply did not exist. So in those regions, a lot more national, illiberal, racist thinking is on the rise amongst those parties, which is still today being very widely spread and disseminated. Let's take a look at the situation in Greece. It's going through a severe financial and social crisis. 60% of the people below 25 years of age have no job. And with regards to the political landscape, with regards to the emerging radical right, is assuming ever greater significance. The Golden Dawn got more than 7% in the last elections, and now it is supposed to win between 9 and 13% of all the votes. So it's the third largest political party in Greece. So is there a direct connection between the economic crisis and the emergence of the Golden Dawn? Or would that be oversimplified? My answer is no. Just to be brief. All this is a trend which set in much earlier. The Golden Dawn was founded a couple of years prior to the crisis. In 2008 and 2009, the Golden Dawn had already been in existence. It had formed a bulwark in the city center of the capital of Athens. That was shortly before the crisis emerged. And what are the reasons for its foundation? Of course, the economic crisis is not irrelevant. Of course, it needs to be factored in as one of the main driving forces. It plays quite a significant role, but we can't all boil it down to the economic crisis only. It's a mixture, it's a whole plethora of different problems. It's a cocktail, because we are also in the middle of a political crisis. If you look at this data from before the crisis, if you look at the data, for example, concerning confidence in politicians by and large, if you look at the trust that the citizens place in the institutions and the political elite, you will realize that as soon as in the mid-2000s, the level of trust was extremely low. So already back then we were in the middle of a political crisis, much earlier than the financial crisis. After 2009 or 2010, when the economic and financial crisis sort of exploded, this turned out to be a fatal mixture. It was a toxic mixture of two different kinds of crises. We were in an economic crisis and in a political crisis. And this triggered the rise of this particularly extremist party. I'm using the term party, but I would like to put it in inverted commas, because it's not an ordinary conventional political party. Golden Dawn is much more than that. It is like a group of fighters. Experts call it like that, but this is how the organization also calls itself. It calls itself a group of combat fighters. It's an organization which has military organizational structures. One of the leading politicians of this party called the Golden Dawn an army. In the course of an interview he gave, he said, "We're an army." And if you look at the way in which the party is organized in greater detail, and if you look at how it works, you can easily understand what is meant by that. It has a lot of military components, so military structures can be found in great numbers within the party. So you could also call this party a militia. It's got very strictly defined internal hierarchical structures, and there's one political leader. So it's not like a party with a significant chief at the top, but it's a party which follows the principle of a leadership. The leader of the party has been appointed for life. Only in the most extreme cases can he be voted out of office, and he's basically free to do what he feels like doing. So this is a very specific type of a political organization, which is structured in a military fashion. It's got a lot of hierarchical structures. It's really closed off. It is not easy to join the party or to look at it in order to understand how it really works and what the basic structures are. You cannot easily understand how you can join the party if you wanted to. Eva Högel, we have spoken a lot about the NSU already. Barbara John told us a lot about it, and she made mention of the very important fact that people deny many of the things that happened. But we do all hope that in the post-NSU time things will change. My question to you is this. According to your opinion, what are the most important political consequences? What are the most important political lessons we can learn? Is it going to have an impact also at the European level? Do we have to embark on strategies to counter right-wing extremism and violence at European level as well? Thank you very much. Let me start off by saying that when we started off doing our work in the NSU committee, it's 2 years ago, we started off in January 2012. All the 11 members of parliament that joined forces in this committee said, well, we've got to find the root of the evil. Maybe some individuals failed, maybe structures failed, a mistake was made. And this is a development which disseminated, and this is why we didn't manage to identify 14 murderers who were underground, who committed 10 murders and bank robberies and whatever. And what we found is something that really makes us very speechless. All of us in this room, ladies and gentlemen, learned that there was failure on the part of all the parties and institutions and individuals involved structures didn't really work out, authorities failed, individuals failed. And, you know, this is a strong word, but I think this is widespread failure of the security forces. It includes the judiciary, people who are politically responsible, the Association for the Protection of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. What are the lessons learned? Sometimes people ask me, well, Mrs. Jung spoke about it, but wasn't it individuals here or there who had a right-wing extremist background? For example, the police officer in Baden-Württemberg who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Had it been that way, it would have been easy to draw the necessary political conclusions. Then you've got 30 right-wing extremists in public authorities who are going to be made redundant. They can't get back to their work, that's it. But what we found was much more complicated. And we cannot sort of erase the problem by learning the political lessons, by making cooperation between the different institutions more smoothly or redefining their areas of responsibility, but we need to bring a profound change of mindset on the part of all of us. So therefore, I think it's not only a failure of the security forces, but it was a failure of society by and large, because the security forces reflect the structures within our society. And what we found in the security forces can also be found in society by and large. And this is why it's so difficult to talk about the consequences, because it goes far beyond the institutions I just described. It goes far beyond cooperation and coordination between institutions. There are two things we identified, as Mrs. Jung has already said. Right-wing extremism was played down for many years. It was not identified as the danger that it really poses to our democracy. So it's simply unacceptable that individuals or entire public authorities or the media do not see that there is right-wing extremism in our society that we tend to play down. The second thing is, and this is quite sobering as well, we've got to learn from that, and Mrs. Jung alluded to this already, but the fact that the victims are of migrant background, that's the way we put it, that they immigrated to Germany, affected 9 of the 10 assassins, and was also reason for the explosions. And this sort of led the public authorities into the wrong direction, because the family members or the victims were associated with criminal offenses. Everybody thought that they're suspicious. I mean, that's how it normally works if you carry out an investigation on the part of the police. So that's it's all fair, everything is acceptable, but all the investigations were carried out. We tried to look in each and every direction, but we left aside racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. And this is attributable to the fact that the victims had a migrant background. And that's something we've got to learn our lesson from. In a nutshell, these two facts, namely not to play down right-wing extremism, strengthening civil society, we all need to take action, and we've got to deal differently with people who look differently, who believe differently, who've got a different color of their skin, different color of their eyes or hairs. This is what we've got to learn. These are the consequences, but it will not be easy to work on that. So therefore, even after the committee has done its work, our job will not be done completely, but it's a task that we've jointly got to address. Thanks very much. Mr. Wallenberg, areas of responsibility, main fields of action, consequences. Commissioner Malmström has already spoken about the radicalization awareness network that you are a member of, and she also spoke about prevention and early intervention. There is a question coming from the internet chat. What is the EU doing in this regard? You are one of the coordinators of the RUN network, the Radicalization Awareness Network. Could you please describe to us what you're doing? What's the task of this network? And what is your specific methodological approach for this good practice intervention? Well, thank you very much. Mrs. Malmström was too modest to elaborate on this in greater detail, because the RUN network really deserves special attention. RUN stands for Radicalization Awareness Network. This network is supposed to deal with all aspects concerning political or religious extremism in Europe on a long-term basis. Mrs. Malmström, and by the way, I didn't know that she worked this out with Martin Schulz together 10 years ago, but It's typical of them, but she took this step with a very strong personal interest and made a lot of financial resources available. For that matter, we managed to create different working groups. And the best thing about this network, and the main reason for its very foundation or for national networks following suit, is that it first and foremost focuses on practical experience. I remember quite well what it was like when I started off 2 years ago in the preparation committee. I joined by coincidence, more or less. There I found 25 people sitting in a room, and they had all reached consensus. The practitioners in the room, the practitioners who work on site, out there in the field, on the problem, are the first that we all have to listen to, because they really know what can be done. The practitioners are social workers, teachers, it's the community policing agents, citizens, policemen, people working in the media. They really know what to do. They are involved in the blog, they are involved in the chats, they work in prisons, they go to prisons in order to do their work there, in order to prevent extremist tendencies from emerging, or they also support exit strategies. So it's the first network of practitioners that I know of. And the main underlying ideas are the following two. They're quite simple and easy to understand. The first idea is this. Practitioners of de-radicalization, which is an odd word, but practitioners in very intensive social work are supposed to exchange their views and experience at European level. What are they doing? What's good about their work? What's not so good? What doesn't work out that well? We speak to Hungarians, Austrians, people from Sweden. I chair a working group with a colleague from Sweden, so we exchange views and opinions, and then they work on political recommendations. What is it that they really need? And they pass on these political recommendations to the institutions in Brussels. They forward it to the commissioner and the institutions in Brussels for them to give shape to them, to pass on resolutions or directives describing what is really needed. Because we want to create the framework conditions at national and European level, which makes it possible for us to take preventive action according to the models that, by experience, prove to be effective and efficient. But some of these strategies are not really attended to, but that is actually what we try to translate into political action. So first of all, in the network, the practitioners are being brought together, they're being listened to, and the second step is that the people who do this work out in the field bring it up to a higher level. This is where politicians give shape to these strategies. And here Brussels was always really helpful, because in Brussels people told us, well, we are bureaucrats, we don't really have a clue. And that was really elevating. You know, when I went to Brussels for the first time, I thought to myself, well, yes, you don't have a clue. But they were the first ones to admit. They told us, tell us exactly what it is, what you need, and we will give you the resources. Tell us what to do, and we'll do it. RAN network, a radicalization awareness network. That's it.
Mr. Minkenberg, just a few days ago, an older right-wing extremist in Notre Dame committed suicide. And he did that with quite a lot of publicity, and he did that, as he said, against the rights of gay couples. And it is it is a problem that covers all of Europe, as we heard also before. And it is not only a problem in Eastern Europe, but in your first statement, and this is also something that that we can find in the article that you wrote for the publication. However, true that Europe is the most dynamic region, so that is the most dynamic soil for right-wing extremism. So in this context, let's talk about anti-Semitism, which can also be felt to be in the increase in Central and Eastern Europe. The Israeli socialists said that there was a German anti-Semitism, and she just coined the term of the cultural code in the times of the German emperor. So does that mean that anti-Semitism is just kind of a common idea, and it has been accepted by a conservative middle class? So would you say that today in Central and Eastern Europe there is something of a similar cultural code, so some kind of climate in which anti-Semitism can grow especially? I'm not really sure whether I can say that. I mean, and cover Central and Eastern Europe and call all of them anti-Semites. So that would be just generalized too much, and it would actually not be true. So just a little while ago, there was a congress in Budapest, and they were sponsored by the government, and so there was criticism of the government's policy by everybody attending this Congress, and they wanted to have more awareness among the Hungarians and more tolerance among the people, and they wanted to see that on the rise. So I would rather say that in a few areas in Central and Eastern Europe, people were not really aware of this as a problem because it had a different situation than in the West as a response to the Holocaust. I believe when we're talking about this problem here, so in Western Europe after the Second World War, so we have undertaken quite a lot of efforts to confront our past, and sometimes we were more successful, sometimes we were less successful, and we attacked anti-Semitism in that context. But in Central and Eastern Europe, there has been a development under dictatorship and under the rule of tyrannies, and they cannot get back to the traditions that they may have in pre-communist times. And so I think that this is the major difference to Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and all the other Western European countries. Apart from the Czech Republic, there is no democracy that existed before the communist regime. And so that is the discussion of that era, so was not really available under communism, and also the discussions of the Nazi occupiers. And all the discussions, in fact, are still in their infancies, I would say, and this is the main issue. So maybe in 20 years' time, the discourses and the discussions will be different. But in all the transformation that these countries have gone through, this was a neglected point. So people are not really concerned with anti-Semitism, and they focus more on racism and other factors that the societies of Central and Eastern Europe are more susceptible to. And in that context, I would say it is a structural problem, and that has to do with the transformation going on now, or rather the democratic histories or non-existence thereof of these countries. So if you can just be anti-Semitic in public, because there is rather a weak civil society, and there's not that much of a strict reaction to that. So I would say that the civil societies in some of the Eastern European countries are not that well developed. I mean, for example, the churches are not really on board of a democratic development, and that. So, for example, if somebody says something along these lines here in the West, then there is immediate reaction, and there is a routine response to that. But when you look at the transformations going on, and also the changes in the constitutions, and I see a transformation going on of the transformed society. So there is a new regime being built up. And in fact, the new regimes are accepting or tolerating statements, anti-Semitic statements much more even. So when you just say that this has been weakened by politics. I mean, people just mentioned that before in the speeches before. So, of course, there's always the question about the national governments, but also the European Union. So, Mr. Sögel, for example, so is there a discussion within the German Parliament, the German Bundestag, and about what we can do? So, for example, when we look at the response to the FPÖ, which is the right-wing extremist party in Austria, so there was a strong reaction against them, but now we don't hear much. But thank you very much for the comparison. So when the FPÖ was part of the government in Austria, so there was a clear response by Europe, in the whole of Europe, in fact, and I welcomed that reaction. But when you look at what is happening now as a response to Hungary and what is happening there, so then you have now the German Parliament here, so we have a diversity of parties here in our Parliament, and we're quite happy with that. So we have a government representative in Hungary, and that is protected by the Chancellor. And then there's their coalition partners. They're not saying anything about that. But we, as the SPD, as the Social Democratic Party, we have sometimes raised our objections. But I mean, there's no major upheaval against that. So I mean, there was a demonstration in front of the Hungarian embassy, but that was not really a good sign. But because we're not against Hungarians as people and against Hungary as a country, but we are against what is happening with regard to anti-Semitism. We have to just speak a lot louder, in fact, to be heard. Ms. Georgiadou, so let me just add one more point. So when you talk about the case of Austria, people didn't really react immediately. So the EU was not really a success in its response, but it was rather that there was people just overreacted. And the damage was not done to Austria, but to the EU. So this is why I believe the EU is now more hesitant before they just react strongly. And when you look at Italy and the Lega Nord and the Alleanza Nazionale, and when they were part of the government, and nothing was done, so everybody remained silent. And when then Austria happened, then there was a strong reaction. So this was not really proportionate, and people understood that lesson, and they tried to be just more cautious with their reactions, but maybe it was not the right lesson to learn. So you pointed out that it's not only due to the economic crisis that the problems have arisen, but it is rather about longer existing ideologies and hatred and prejudices and stereotypes. But in times of economic crisis, they become aggravated. And there was also some statements in our internet chat on the combination of political crisis and ecological crisis, or rather economic crisis, I'm sorry. So what is their influence on the situation? Maybe if here in the case of Greece. So in our publication, we also have examples of Spain and Portugal. And for example, there is a case study on Portugal. And when you read this article on Portugal, you find out that despite all the crisis going on in these countries, and despite their experience with dictatorships, there is nothing comparable going on there. So the political right is not as much on the rise as it is in Greece. So where do you think are the differences? Let me start with that point. There are, of course, some things in common, but also things that are completely different in Greece compared to Spain and Portugal. So, for example, the differences are quite obvious, some of them, but there are also things that we have in common. All these three countries are part of the late democracies in Europe, as we call them. They became democracies in the third wave of democracy, of democratization. So that's why we call them late democracies. But this had a good impact because the memories of authoritarian regimes were still there, and they helped the citizens being deterred from voting for a right-wing extremist party. And this is the reason why we see, at least for the period of the consolidation period of democracy in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, a lack of these parties, or that these parties, in fact, were rather irrelevant. So these are the things that all these countries have in common. But of course, there are differences. And the differences are also mentioned in the publication, in fact. One major difference that I see, for example, is that in Portugal and Spain, right-wing extremists and right-wing radical groups are much more fragmented than they are in Greece. And in Greece, during this phase of the consolidation of democracy, that is in the 70s and the 80s of the last century, the right-wing conservatives tried everything they could to get together the established right with the right-wing extremists. But at the end of the 90s, at the beginning of this new millennium, this didn't work any longer. And this is why it is especially in Greece that we have seen a rise in right-wing extremism. And this is not happening in Spain and Portugal, because these are countries in which the right-wing extremist and right-wing radical groups used to be very fragmented and are still very fragmented. I believe that this plays a positive role in the development of these countries, and this is one of the main reasons why there is no party equivalent to the Golden Dawn Party in Greece. I have looked at the data with regard to xenophobia as well. Mr. Minkenberg, do you also have data like that? Or actually, you have data like that you used for the article in the publication. So I have similar data, and we have seen that the xenophobia in Greece, or actually some kind of xenophobic attitude in Greece, is higher than similar attitudes of opinions in Spain and Portugal. But you also have to take into consideration that in Spain and also in Portugal, after 2008 and 2009, xenophobia has grown. And I believe that there's also a similar tendency when you take a closer look at the data with regard to confidence in the government. And I mentioned that before, that 10 years ago in Greece, we had something similar. There was no confidence in the political systems and in political elites. But in Spain and Portugal, up to 2009, the values are were more or less average with regard to trusting the political system or not. So I believe that this is very important. Just up until recently, that is, just up until 2 or 3 years ago, these countries did not live through a political crisis. But everything has changed in the course of the financial crisis, and as of 2010, and this is an important point, Portugal and Spain have shown similar tendencies, just as Greece. So projections, of course, are difficult, so especially in social studies and when you just look at social phenomena. But experts in Spain, in particular, are saying that maybe in the upcoming European elections, the Platform for Freedom, which is a sister party of the Platform for Catalonia, is a very dynamic party. And maybe they will be represented at European level, that is in the European Parliament. That is the combination of ideology and social crisis. Are you saying that? Well, in a way, yes. This mixture is beneficial for right-wing populists and right-wing extremists. In their vocabulary, they're using the discourse on seeing the world and the society as two separate entities. And if it is not only just a discourse, when it is not just statements, but it is about attitudes and opinions, and then when you look at the vocabulary of the right-wing extremists and the right-wing radicals, and when political crisis is becoming more and more credible to the society at large. So a mixture of political crisis, financial crisis, and economic crisis, and that is not trusting politics, difficult labor conditions, difficult labor market. All those are factors that the right-wing extremists and radicals benefit from. The part of their agenda, they are always saying that about all the politicians and the parties, and we have heard that from the Golden Dawn for 2 years, that all the politicians, all the parties are corrupt and that all parties are the same. They have been saying that all along as well. And if then public opinion is just going in the same direction, then these statements are well received, at least among one group of society. Did you want to come in on that? These are disastrous developments, I would say, and I always wonder, and it's also been dealt with in empirical studies, is what to do. What can we do? These are percentages that should be a wake-up call for us. So we, as the practitioners, are dealing with young people. Mostly it is young people. I mean, of course, not only that are the problem. The young people, they are the ones that we have to reach out to. So we have to prevent them from becoming radicalized, or maybe even if they have already committed some of criminal offenses, we have to just find out what to do with them and how to help them. Of course, we could talk about this for hours on end, and I don't really know where to start myself, but let me just point out that in the book that has just been published, we have drawn up some conclusions that we had fun collecting, in fact. So I had just joined the group just a little while ago. So although I had been a practitioner for a while, so with the help of that network, so we were able to have an exchange with 17 and 18 countries, and we call ourselves first-line practitioners. And so we have set up this networks, and we just found out what the good practice approaches are. So Mr. Schulz said this today, that there's no silver bullet, that he can't offer a silver bullet, but I would say, well, we do. We know what to do. We have some guidelines for you. So maybe we can just discuss what can be recommended and what should not be done. So we shouldn't start with the negative, but let me just point out that we have a culture of democratic education in Europe. That is not bad, but when you're dealing with radicalized young people, then you can't just reach out to them by political education offers. So, and one of the counter strategies that people use, and it makes sense, so when you just have already had examples or incidents of aggression and xenophobia, there is anti-aggression seminars that are carried out. And elements of these seminars are good, but they're not enough. I mean, they're not in line with the challenge that we need to live up to. And it's not only about aggression that needs to be fought, but the problem is much more complex. So it is actually something like changing a person's personality. So when you just know seminars about putting somebody in a hot chair, so don't do something like that. So what we're dealing with is young people. So when you want to work with young people and when you want them to listen to you, then you have to establish a rapport with them. I mean, not a personal rapport, but a professional one that is based on trust. So if you can establish that rapport, and it's going to be hard work to do that, and there are some methods how to do that. And once you have their trust, then you have to make sure that the people can also talk about their experiences and get together with others and talk about their daily lives. And I have my background in psychotherapy, and I would say that group work is very good. So when we do talk about social work and prevention work, then we have to get used to pull all the resources that we have and then have our practical approach according to that.
Well, since there seem to be many promising methodologies around, how can you establish closer ties to the other networks at different levels, at European, national, and also regional level? Would you say that you need more networks, closer networks, in order to exchange views and support political decision makers in the European Parliament or also in the national government and the German Bundestag? There was a rather skeptical chat participant who made a statement on that particular subject matter. Are there areas where politicians reacted to the experts' opinion, or is there a link missing? What's your viewpoint on this? With regards to linkages, we in the Xenox national program have contributed very actively. In the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, we have established close networks and provided expertise. Would that be needed at European level as well? How can we establish these links, which are so badly needed? That's a very good question. Give us more time. We've just had a meeting of the ministers of the interior this winter, where our main idea was that simple people like me get in close contacts with high-ranking politicians such as ministries, but there is lots of room for improvement. But you're absolutely right in saying we need closer networks and more links in all these areas that need to be interconnected. But whatever you do, don't forget the practitioners. I don't want to ask the question of who of us in this room is a real practitioner. What are the real practitioners? Well, the people who are working with young people. Now, if I ask the question here, my question is who over a longer period of time throughout his professional career worked intensively with young people that were or are endangered of slipping into extremist or violent groups. Here, of course, you have to do personal face-to-face pedagogical work, and there are not many who are involved in this. We need to increase their numbers. And whenever you try to establish a network, you need to make sure that you speak to many practitioners, as many as possible. They are normally highly motivated and they have a very strong personal interest in what they're doing. Therefore, they have a vast body of knowledge of how de-radicalization can be brought about most successfully. You're talking about networks. Yes, of course. The European Commission with Mrs. Malmström, due to this historical coincidence that made her become responsible for domestic affairs, has managed to create a very strong network and create an initiative for that purpose, and we're about to get started. But there are many others who are asked to join in and establish a network as well. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation has an international network with different liaison offices in different countries, which have always worked along this tradition, recruited members to fight against xenophobia and racism. So it's a very liberal organization. Not many networks are willing to share as much as you are. Another important network that should be mentioned in this context that I enjoy cooperating with is the OECD in Vienna. It's also equally liberal and is represented in 60 or 70 or 80 countries doing similar work. Here in Germany, we also have the Federal Association for Political Education. I just named the organizations that I'm in contact with. And of course, since its foundation in 2002 by Gerhard Schröder, this network of the federal model projects has been in existence for more than 10 years. They develop very innovative projects and try them out and test them. Projects which unfortunately sometimes get done and dusted in the shelves of politicians because, and this brings me back to the point that was made earlier, we are missing the strategy to make use of the know-how that was pooled over recent years and to provide the necessary financial resources to the trainers so that they can work effectively and efficiently in protecting youngsters who are endangered from slipping into an extremist or violent group. Thank you very much. These were the practitioners in the room, mind you, says the speaker. Well, please prepare yourself for questions. We will throw the floor open to you in the audience in a minute. So please get ready. But before doing so, Eva Högel, NPD, the ban on an NPD. This is an instrument which is heatedly discussed in Germany, also due to our constitutional provisions. Would you say that the instrument of banning a political party with neo-Nazi and racist party manifestos, is this a German specificity, this approach, which of course is closely linked to our history? But would you personally say that the instrument of banning a political party is something that might be a success in other European countries as well? Well, the hurdles for banning political parties are extremely high in Germany, not only here, but also in other European countries. The European Convention on Human Rights, for example, also provides for certain rules and regulations to be adhered to. That's important because political parties are of great significance, and the freedom of expression is an underlying principle of our very democratic system. And therefore we don't take it lightheartedly, not only because the hurdles are pretty high, but it won't help us solve the problem, or at least only parts of the problem. If we ban the NPD, and this is what I'm very much in favor of, together with the SPD parliamentary group and the ministers of the interior and the premiers of the federal states, then we cannot eradicate the individual right-wing extremists altogether or their ideology, but it's simply one measure of a set of measures to counter right-wing extremism. And we justifiably so thought about it for a long time. Unfortunately, the first attempt to ban the party failed. I think it should be banned because I find it simply unbearable that such a xenophobic party, and we in Berlin know it all too well, ladies and gentlemen, simply remember what happened prior to the last elections. You know, the NPD's election slogan was step on the gas pedal or gas it up, so to speak. I experienced myself what the police had to do in Schöneweide. It had to sort of let the NPD go, which said, by the way, Europe must go. That's simply unbearable, and I find it also unbearable that we finance the party with taxpayers' money. I mean, thanks for your applause and thank you for your support. We can really need it. But, you know, when people say it like this, it might sound like a populist position, but these are my two reasons why I'm in favor of banning the NPD. And I find it hard to bear that the national government is not really taking on that active stance in order to make a proposal, which is hopefully what the federal states are going to do. But there are still some hurdles in our way, as I read. And I also found it very hard to bear that the German Bundestag did not submit the proposal either. I would have liked to see if all the three constitutional institutions would have moved into the same direction. Now we've got to keep our fingers crossed for the proposal to be submitted by the Bundesrat, the second German chamber, and then we've got to keep our fingers crossed once again for banning the party. I think it would be important in order to counter right-wing extremism. Banning the party, yes, would also help us to reach more ground in other European issues, but I'm also working in other areas, ladies and gentlemen, for the connoisseurs amongst you. Our 5% hurdle in European elections was done away with due to the German Constitutional Court. We tried to introduce a hurdle of 3%. I know that hurdles make it difficult for parties to join a parliament from a legal standpoint. This too needs to be analyzed very carefully, but I think these parties should not be given a chance to be represented in the European Parliament. Thank you very much. 2 reactions to that, but please be brief, because now we want to throw the floor open for the general discussion. A few more words on banning parties in other countries. There are examples such as Belgium, where the Vlaamse Blok was banned 2002. Half a year later, the Vlaams Belang was founded with the same people and the same party manifesto, using the same symbols, believe it or not. I'm a bit skeptical that you can actually achieve a lot by banning a party. With all due respect for the reasons that you mentioned, of course the party must disappear. The Belgians have initiated a draft bill where parties can be hollowed out financially speaking without having to banning them when they instigate xenophobic ideas. You know, you can hollow them out, but the NPD seems to dissolve itself, really. Maybe a ban is not really needed anymore because it's in a dire financial situation. And maybe a new party will be founded which is going to take over, but it's sort of destroying itself. But if you ban a party, of course, you need to expect that those who still foster these ideological ideas find other ways and means of disseminating them, or by taking action in order to make their voice heard, which is even more dangerous. So it might have ambiguous consequences on the European level. I would also like to come in on that. This is an issue which has kept us very busy in Greece for quite some time, the issue of banning parties. We also heatedly discussed the consequences, which are twofold, of course. I accept what you were saying, but maybe if we deal with an extremist party right after its very establishment, we might take measures which are a bit more positive than party bans. You know, in the Belgium case, banning the party didn't really turn out to be a success. In Greece, we are dealing with a young parliamentary party, which is not really firmly established and deeply rooted in our society. It is voted for by many different groups of the electorate. But many of the voters are not really convinced of the underlying political principles and ideologies of the party. For that matter, I do hold the view, and I'm just talking into the bag, you know. I'm thinking aloud. I don't know what would be better. Would it be better to ban the Golden Dawn? Maybe not necessarily so. But we should be given the institutional tools, as is currently the case in Germany, which doesn't exist in Greece. But without having the institutional and legal tools, we cannot really take any action. But maybe we should create these instruments as quickly as possible. And simultaneously think of whether this might have a positive impact on the quality of our democracy to ban the party. Maybe it won't. Thanks very much for this additional point from a Greece perspective. Now we've realized that banning a party can only be one part and parcel of a much more comprehensive strategy when we try to counter right-wing extremism with the help of political institutions and a civil society strategy. Now, there are the first requests for the floor. Please ask your questions. There are 3 microphones in the room. Please, let us know who you are and which institution you work for. Please, the gentleman over there and then over here. Karl-Heinz Niedermeyer, Special Committee for Peace and Development of the SPD Berlin. I'd like to seize this opportunity to talk about counter-right-wing extremism and anti-Semitic parties. What happens at the interparliamentary level? Let us take a look at the Ukraine, the Svoboda party, which after the last national election got dramatic support from less than 1% to more than 10%. It moved into parliament. And the parliament presidium also consists of representatives of that party. There was a committee which cooperated with a subcommittee on migration at the Berlin level. The parliamentary groups at national and European level were asked to refrain from cooperating with this Ukrainian political party, or if that's not possible, boil it down to what's necessary. I neither got a reaction from the PSE reaction nor from the parliamentary group representative in the German parliament. Berbert Hofelmacher is a representative of the German-Ukrainian friendship group, but she never got back to me, although, as far as I heard, a proposal was submitted to the parliamentary group suggesting to ban or put an end to cooperation with this particular political party.
I guess that was a question for me, so because you talked about the parliamentary group in SPD, so you mentioned Bärbel Hoflogen, but I can't really say much about this party, but I mean, I will take on board the suggestion that you just made to think about what parties will work with, and I mentioned Hungary, so Fidesz, for example, is still a member of the European People's Parties, and I think that this is a scandal. So I believe it is true that we have to just use everything that we can in order to isolate these parties. But it is also true to see that isolation is not the best way to go ahead. So the Svoboda is something that I can't mention, that I can't comment on right now. But I will talk to Bärbel about it. Good afternoon. My name is Nana. So I work for Metrocom. I have a question for Mrs. Högl, and I have another question for Mrs. Georgiadou. My question is about what you also said about Hungary, and I'm grateful that you mentioned Hungary. But what I wanted to say is, don't you think that the federal government is using a double standard here? So let me just give you an example. So, for example, the enlargement of the Schengen Agreement. There was the problem in Romania, and people talked about the corruption and all the Roma issues. But when it came to Hungary, and as you mentioned it yourself, then all these issues were ignored. And that actually by the federal German government, they were just turning a blind eye to that. So don't you think that the German government should just call a spade and talk to the Hungarian government and say this is not the way ahead? So that with the right-wing opposition party accepting them in a way that they do, even though they express themselves in very anti-Semitic ways, so and attack synagogues, for example, that this is an unacceptable situation. And my question for Mrs. Georgiadou is, don't you think that it would be counterproductive when you just look at the economic problems in Greece and the economic situation in Greece, and you have a more differentiated picture of right-wing extremism and xenophobia. But when you then generalize, on the other hand, that when the Federal Chancellor went to Greece and the Greek minister was here in Germany, and the Chancellor and the government were called as if they had the same status as Hitler. So don't you think that was just a bit too much? I don't think that's very productive if, on the one hand, you need help, you need support in order to get back onto a sound basis, but at the same time, the government doesn't criticize these extremist statements and that they just accept them or tolerate them. Who would like to start? Go ahead. Well, my answer is the following. Enemies and stereotypes have to be dismantled everywhere. So no matter what the financial situation is like, so whether it's a good one or a bad one. Of course, there are these stereotypes of who is the enemy. In Greece, that is the case, but it is also the case in all the other countries in crisis and in other European countries. In Greece, there may be just a very specific point because they use the Chancellor as their target, and so she is the personified enemy. And in a lot of countries, there are all kinds of stereotypes. And when you look at the German perception of in the German media of Greeks, and that is not very positive either. So I remember there was an article in a weekly magazine which was not very positive about Greeks. And of course, the same is happening in Greece as well, so that there are these stereotypes about others, and that have to do, for example, with history. But unfortunately, we have that happen in Greece, and all these citizens who, just like me, and I guess who, just like you, all of you here, see themselves as European citizens. We need to dismantle these stereotypes, these negative stereotypes, and the images of enemies. So, would you like to come in on that, Mr. Feinberg? Yes, I would like to do that. So we are now here with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and we are all politically interested, and we express our concern. And we are right in expressing our concerns, and it is we do that rightly so. But it's not only about expressing your dissents, but you also have to fight politically and take political action. What my problem is that I always need to focus on not only talking about the fight and all the concerns, that we have to reach out to the young people and talk to them. We should prepare ourselves well when we talk to them. So if we just take the same debate here to them, and then we won't be successful. So if we just talk about the political fights and all the political propaganda and slogans, that is all fine and dandy, but I think that we need further training for our experts. And these experts are those that I mean to talk to the young people. Mr. Schulz said that in his speech as well. So he says one of these questions was, how can you reach out to them? How can you access them? And this is the first question that we, as the practitioner established, we are not in touch with 10 to 20% of the young people and also the older generation that are xenophobic. Then what do you do? So if you don't talk to them, if you don't have direct access, so there's nothing you can do. So if you just have good political points and a good discussion, that won't help. I'm not really sure whether Mrs. Yohn is still here in the room. She said, you need to stand up. You need to show your face, and you need to look at the other people's face. And you have to ask these people who express some right-wing extremist ideas about their lives, about their experiences, what made them say this. And there was also some reaction here on the internet. So can you just describe your workshops? So the work that you do, so the way that Mrs. Jorn described standing up and showing your face, how do you do that in your seminars? Well, I mean, of course, I would love to do that. So we have some basic guidelines like 7 and more than 7 and 8. So we would be talking for hours on end. So what you have as good practice is what every teacher and police officers knows. That is when you need to build up a rapport. So you just need to you don't need to lecture these people, but just use narratives, and you will see that it's much more fun. So if you just shout at, say, right-wing extremists and yell your slogans at them, then you won't get anywhere. But when you just talk in narratives, then you get closer to each other. And so my first and foremost message to all political action is that this work needs to be done by external third-party people. So when you work in prisons, so you shouldn't take the prison psychotherapist to do that. Or when you go to schools, you shouldn't have the liaison teacher do that. And I mean, if you want to reach the boss, you don't talk to this. You don't have the secretary just explain your points. So you have to have a third-party expert. So, for example, when you just talk to somebody in prison, this person is not really interested in ideology, but they are just interested in improving their situation. So if you want to reach out to these people, you need to have a third-party person, somebody who's from the outside. And this is the basics of psychological work. And every psychologist knows that, and you have to just translate it to the political field. So when I'm saying somebody out from the outside, then I don't mean just like kind of anybody, but some people who work for different organizations. I work for 2 organizations here in Berlin, for example, and since 2000, that is since we've had the federal model projects, we've had a lot of independent organizations doing excellent work. And they only have 1-year contracts. We know that they only work with temporary contracts, and they have to invent new projects. And the best people will then go elsewhere if they don't see a future in the organization that they work for. And we have to do something about that, because their work has a direct influence on the preventions that they can achieve in their seminars, in their day-to-day work. I think there was a second part of this question, and ladies and gentlemen, so I think that I was very clear in my words about Hungary. And the biggest problem that we have with regard to Hungary is indifference. I mean, people are not really interested in what is happening in Hungary. Some experts are interested in that, and some people who take a closer look. But in general, there is indifference. And of course, I agree with you that we would have to do a lot more. We would have to go there and travel there and talk to the opposition. We would have to we have to carry out some political activities. But it is not that easy. We are lacking the political tools at the European level. So you said exactly, I mean, what the problem is. Can we just throw them out? No, of course we can't. So this is the reason why Mrs. Malmström has initiated the non-compliance dispute, or that complaint with which we try to have an influence on the situation in Hungary. So just my final comment. So if Hungary was to apply for membership of the European Union, they would never succeed, because Hungary has changed its democracy in such a way that they're no longer in line with the the principles of the EU. So, but I don't know what the magic bullet is either. So I just think that we have to work together and do something. So I'm sorry that you had to wait for so long, but you have the floor now. My name is Zacharias. I am a lawyer, actually a law student, and I have a question for Professor Minkenberg. Today, Mr. Schulz said in his speech that on the 19th of April he was invited to Warsaw, to Poland, on the occasion of the memorial service for the revolt of the Warsaw Ghetto. And you are a professor at a Polish university. So what about the reactions to that? So did you see any reaction to that memorial service or to that event among your students? Well, I can just simply answer that question by saying no. Well, in fact, I didn't see any reactions. So I'm not really sure whether there were reactions, but I didn't perceive of anything. So there was not much of a discourse about what Mr. Schulz was doing in Warsaw. But I know that my Polish students are aware of things like that, though. The German-Polish relationship is something that they are very well aware of. So I wouldn't be surprised if internally among themselves, and not in any official dialogues, but among themselves, that they talked about it. So this is just what I think because of the experience that I have with my students, but there was no official reaction by the students at my university. Benno Fischer, I work for an organization against forgetting and remembering. So I have two questions for Mr. Weinberg. What about the term practitioner? So I need a better definition for that. Would you call a practitioner somebody who can be or is a role model? Because a role model as some kind of person has to do with people's identities. And when I now stay with the term practitioner, then you assume that there should be a narrative. But what is the narrative? What is the narrative for young people? Or actually, what was the narrative that got them where they are now? So that you need to talk to them. So, and it would be a question of making the practitioner superfluous if we knew how they got there and prevent that. And I have a question for you, Mr. Minkenberg, as well. So our title is Europe of Diversity Against Xenophobia. So, but don't you think that diversity is something that that is quite a challenge to people, and that it is responsible for the problems that we're talking about here? And Mrs. Hürgel, I have a question for you as well. So you said that the society has failed, and you said that with regard to what was happening in the NSU proceedings. But would you also say that it is possible that the society itself wouldn't see that as a failure? And but if they did, how could they get out of it? And yes, thank you very much for your questions, and then we can have the answers later on. Helmut Rück, I'm just an ordinary citizen. I have a question for you, Mr. Melzer. And in your study, there are three important countries that were not covered in your publication. That is the UK, France, and Spain. So would you say that the problems there are of minor importance compared to Poland? So I was rather surprised by your selection of countries. So who would like to start? So, Mr. Weinberg, there was a direct question for you. So, again, about the definition of practitioners. Okay, so maybe I can just put the ball back into your court. So, when you say that practitioners should be role models, so I believe that they need to be much more. So, of course, they also need to be role models. That is also part of it. But a practitioner is somebody who, in his function or her function, has direct access to young people vulnerable to extremism or who have already committed some offenses. So in the framework of the RAN network, these may be police officers, social workers, or probation officers, people working in prisons. And these are all people who have direct access, who are directly in touch with these young people, and they need some type of guidelines. And a practitioner means also somebody who does de-radicalization work and call themselves de-radicalization expert, and they develop their own methodologies. And so practitioners are also people doing rapport work. The Swedish government talk about relational workers. So relational workers, they use the term relationship. It's a great term, but it is also a bit of a mouthful. So we are relational workers. And of course, we have to be role models. But when we are role models, so we're not doing that with loud narratives or just personal narratives, but rather as listeners, as those who just listen to the young people and ask the one or two questions, but rather just take a passive role and just find out what the young people did or experienced that made them extremists. And the narratives that you mentioned, I mean, I'm not saying that this is just kind of the major narrative that I try to get to young people, but what I ask for is what the people's own narratives are. And maybe can you imagine what I mean by that? So if you have their trust, then you talk about dysfunctional families, about domestic violence, about experiences of being humiliated within your family, and about marginalization, talking about gender, and, for example, the idea of what is a man, what is a woman, and what is a homosexual, for example. And so ask them what they think about these concepts and who they know, and so try and find out what their real opinions are. And these are all the small narratives that I can collect in a group, and in the course of some weeks, you can find out about them. So you can't just find out about them in a seminar or over a weekend, and you can't learn them. But a lot of practitioners in Germany and in Europe know how to make people talk about that, because they have found out how to do that, and they don't have a loud voice. We have to just turn to them and ask them what we can do.
Mr. Minkenberg, yes, you actually addressed a very painful question, because that's the root of the evil. Many studies have revealed that there are problems of adjustments with regards to large parts of the population when it comes to processes of change, modernization, or processes of pluralization within society. Let me just give you one example. The right-wing extremist parties are particularly strong and significant in those countries where there is cultural homogeneity, be it Catholic or Protestant, such as Denmark. And at the same time, almost overnight, the society became pluralistic and diverse. The Islam is the most visible sign of this development. So countries where this change took place in a rather short space of time, this trend towards pluralization has brought about fears amongst the population that the parties react to. So there is tremendous potential in those countries, for example, Britain or the Netherlands. They've had a long history of cultural plurality and diversity. There have always been minorities and migrants in those countries. Therefore, they know how to deal with a diverse society. Over the last 30 years in those two countries, the situation with regards to extremists was rather modest. But how do you deal with new phenomena that emerge, and how do you react to it? Of course, there's no point in telling the people, well, you enjoy going to the Italian or for a Spanish meal. You know, that's cheap and of no use. So therefore you can forgo using these arguments. But there's no point either in the premier of a country saying, well, multiculturalism is dead or it failed. But we've got to identify the problems that there are. We also managed to bring about positive achievements and make people fearless. Make sure that they understand that they don't have to be afraid. I mean, here we don't talk about the prevention of violence or aggression, but how can you explain to the voters that the arguments that our counterparts are using are not plausible? There are a lot of discrepancies. One of my colleagues called it a permanent intellectual nuisance of the parties. You know, you need to put them under pressure by arguments that the voters are able to understand, not in a sophisticated manner and not in a populistic fashion either, but in a way that people understand. And then you can make more ground. But the problem is that we've got problems of adjustments. There are cognitive and emotional problems concerning values, and this creates horror scenarios that these parties abuse. That's what we've got to address. Mr. Fischer, you asked me a question as well. Thank you very much. It fits in nicely with the slogan of this conference, namely, the others, that's us. Why did I speak about the failing society? Well, I've been in my position for 1.5 years, and my colleagues in the inquiry committee always spoke about the failure of the security forces. And whenever we hear the witnesses, and this does not always reach out to the general public, we are always saying that our security forces are really doing a good job on a day-to-day basis. Many of our civil servants are doing a great work, but this is something that went unnoticed in the general media. That's a point I wanted to make here. Second point, why did the security forces fail? Well, because they reflect our society. This is where our neighbors are working, our friends are working. These are not systems that are completely closed off the security forces, but we know the policeman from around the corner who might be our neighbor or is in charge of patrolling our streets. So therefore, if I realized that there was prejudice on the part of the police, and this is what we realized, then we might also find the same prejudice in the population by and large. And that's what we need to work on. The media was not aware of it either. Hans Leindecker from the Süddeutsche Zeitung was mentioned as an example. I spoke to him and I asked him, well, why didn't you realize some of your colleagues are out there doing investigative journalism for more than decades? They do their research. They are represented in this milieu. Andrea Röttgen is an expert in our midst. Nobody was aware of it. And we, in the society by and large, were taken by surprise. We were deeply shocked. This is why I said it was not only a failure of the security forces, by all of us involved. Now, let me give you one example, which I thought about quite a lot. Well, why didn't we all realize it? We tried to come up with an answer. And this is a question of closeness and distance. This is very much in line with what Barbara John said earlier on. My favorite example is Günter Beckstein. I'm far away from it. I'm not a follower of his, but Günter Beckstein knew the first victim, the flower dealer Ünvar Waschek in Nuremberg. And I mean, in the inquiry committee, when he was informed about the murder, he said, could that have been an act of xenophobia? And it becomes even more tragic when you look at what happened after the 9th assassination was committed. Halle Gjoskath in Kassel, who was killed in this internet cafe. Günter Beckstein once again wrote an urgent note on this newspaper article. Might this have been an act of xenophobia? Well, if somebody knows somebody and does not issue warning by saying, well, he's a drug dealer or a criminal, but if he's the flower dealer working around the corner, then you might perceive people in a different fashion. I mean, I don't want to overdo it a little bit, but it shows me that it all depends on how you evaluate people and how you perceive them. This triggers certain developments in our minds, and what happened as a consequence of the blast in Cologne. People said immediately this was an act of criminals, but not a terrorist effect, is what really concerned us. profoundly in the Committee of Inquiry. That's what we've got to work on. We've got to overcome these stigmata, these prejudices, and these misallocations. And this has something to do with distance or closeness. And it's very important to mention this in this context. One last statement. We must prevent one mistake from being made. Right, extremist terrorism, NSU, these were the three guys over there. It has nothing to do with us. But this brings me back to the title of our conference, The Others, That's Us. That's very much what it boils down to at the end of the day. Now, the gentleman in the back of the room asked me about the number of articles in our publication or the selection of countries. No, the three countries then you mentioned, Britain, Spain, and France, were not left out altogether because we believe that the problem does not exist in those countries. No, I just described the problem in France that we had with the tremendous support of the Front National. You know, that's just the way it is. When you get such a big process up and running, you've got to make choices. And we've already published a preliminary publication in 2011 where France is covered in one particular article. We just had to ask ourselves also with regards to the appropriate weighing and the right balance between the East and the West, which countries to select. Of course, we wanted to include the Southern European countries which are now in crisis, such as Greece. We also decided to focus on one additional Southern European country where the situation is rather similar only, and then we chose Italy, not Spain. But of course, the problem affects us throughout the whole of Europe. But you know, the book is quite thick, and therefore you've got to make choices, and it wasn't possible for us to cover these three mentioned countries as well. Gerd Hanneford from the Cultural Office of Saxony, Federal Association for Democracy Development. I'm here because, Mr. Weinberg, I would like to add to what you've just said. There is one aspect that needs to be factored in. Up here in the panel, there is one more point that should be mentioned in greater detail, because thanks to the commitment of the national government for 13 years, civil society organizations are in place which help us gain more ground in this respect. This is very much in line with the practitioners' approaches that you just described and the projects that Mr. Schulz alluded to in his presentation. When the Lord Mayor calls upon the citizens to take action, you need to find people who are willing to do so. Of course, and this was his plea, the individuals are not strong enough and cannot make their voices heard as strongly as groups, and these groups need support. I'm thinking of the following situation. For example, in a sports association or in a church, all of a sudden people turn radical and racist. You might find out where are the local structures. These processes need support. This is simply an additional piece of information in line with what you've told us. I think we've really made major headway in this regard in Germany. The national government has just decided to continue to keep these national programs alive. And in order to support the groups as we can, we need to get into contact with the federal state representatives, because if they don't get the signal from the government saying that these civil society organizations continue to do their job beyond 2014 always, then the federal states might not be able to provide the funding. And that would be a real pity, because these civil society organizations are actually doing what you've just described on site at the local level, because practitioners are not up there working in the clouds. But at the end of the day, what it all boils down to is politics.
Ja, vielen Dank. Das war ja jetzt mehr ein Statement als eine Frage. Ich sehe ja auch Zustimmung auf dem Podium, sodass wir darauf jetzt nicht unbedingt noch mal reagieren. Ich würde jetzt gerne 2 Fragen noch zulassen und dann die Podiumsdiskussion beenden. Sie bitte und Sie bitte. Bitte.
I was a member of the Berlin Senate for a while, and I was also teaching actively, and I'm also a political activist. I have to admit that I don't really have questions, but I would like to allude to 2 things that struck me in the course of your presentations. I think our value orientation is of particular significance. If you look at what can be read in the book, with regard to right-wing extremism, it has not only got to do with education. Although Mr. Schulze intended to put it that way, but that will not suffice. We've learned from history that there were a lot of Nazis who were very well educated, and others weren't, So therefore, value orientation plays a major role and should not be underestimated. Our value principles also play a significant role in education and science and enlightenment in this regard. That's one point. The second point is the narrative. Now here I've learned from experience that this plays a major role as well. Young people are much more willing to listen and to hear. I'm not only talking about those who got off the beaten track, but those who are actually only curious. They want to find out what happened. They listen in a completely different fashion than was the case 10 years ago. That plays a major role. And then the others, that's us, Europe of diversity. This is extremely significant. And that's what the so-called very well-educated people needs to be made much clearer. Due to its history, the Central European societies play a very important role. I mean, Sarrazin is not a typical German name, is it? Or other names that occur to me in this context. I mean, we also use a lot of words. In the history of Berlin, we've had a Turkish cemetery for a long time and a Jewish parish. Our language reflects this very strongly. This is multicultural societies. The others are us. They are already part and parcel of us. That's what we need to make much clearer, and therefore we need much more education and information and enlightenment. Thank you very much for that statement as well. And this nice way of interpreting our title. Now the last question. My name is Mr. Geigenmüller. I'm from the local branch office of Verdi in Pankow. My question to the Member of Parliament is this. I fully agree with what you've said concerning our community of values and how we are supposed to behave. That concerns states as well. We spoke about Hungary by way of example, but not a single statement was made with regards to the Baltic states, and I would like to mention them because in the Baltic states, year by year, marches take place with everything that goes along with that. And I hold the view that if you turn to individual states as a national government or the parliament, and if you criticize violations of human rights in those respective countries, and I don't want to allude to a single country right now, but why don't you do so with regards to the governments of the Baltic states? Because especially in these three states, a great number of Jews were killed. And the SS command structures in that region consisted of voluntary workers from those countries. That should not be forgotten, Mrs. Högel. Right, thank you very much, Mr. Geigenmüller, for that important piece of information concerning the Baltic states. I think it was already mentioned that, of course, we try to look at each and every single country, not only the European Union, but the whole of Europe. That's a very important piece of information. But with regards to the national government and its meetings with the heads of states of the Baltic states, what they discuss is something I'm not informed about. Unfortunately, I do not attend these meetings, and normally this is not being discussed in the national parliament either, but I'll gladly ask my colleagues from the Committee on Foreign Affairs and European Affairs who are responsible for the Baltic states. I'm not a rapporteur for these regions, but I will talk to my colleagues. Why not ask critical questions and the representatives of the government? So thank you very much for that piece of information. I'd like to add to that. Thank you very much by referring to the Baltic states. In Mr. Minkenberg's article in our publication, you will find a graph on xenophobia in Europe. For the year 2008, the three Baltic states were covered. And here they have the highest percentages for the level of xenophobia amongst the population. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now reached the end of the panel discussion. But please be patient and bear with us. Of course, you will get something to eat and to drink. during the informal part of this event, but before we move over to the exhibition room, we would like to listen to a piece of music. Now, before doing so, I'd like to thank the panelists first and foremost. Thank you very much for your contributions. And thanks to all of you in the audience for your active contributions. Thanks very much for your questions. Thank you very much to the participation of the internet users. I would also like to thank the interpreters who appreciate the kind words of appreciation. They ensured that we managed to understand each other. And thanks very much to all the participants and the colleagues who contributed to this publication. Thanks very much for preparing and organizing this conference. Thank you very much, Sebastian Serafin. Thank you very much, Mrs. Burmeiser from the Federal Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor. No, she's in the back of the room giving us away.
Ganz herzlichen Dank auch an das BMAS für die sehr gute Zusammenarbeit, auch an Sie persönlich im Rahmen des Xenos Sonderprogramms Ausstieg zum Einstieg.